She was thrown out for birthing a triplets girl, until the silent man took her hand. The night Clara May brought 3 daughters into the world, the air outside the ranch house smelled of smoke and dust. Storm clouds gathered over the Wyoming plains, but none rumbled louder than Thomas Granger's anger inside. The midwife had swaddled the girls with trembling hands, whispering prayers over their fragile heads, while Clara May, pale and drenched in sweat, reached for her husband's hand. He didn't take it. Thomas's jaw clenched as though he'd been handed a curse. 3 girls, he spat, pacing the wooden floor. Not one son, not even one. His boots struck the planks like gunfire. Clara May's eyes, tired but shining with the glow of motherhood, pleaded for him to see their beauty, their innocence. "They're ours," she whispered hoarsely. "Thomas, look at them. Listen to them breathe." But his face hardened. To him, sons carried the Granger name, worked the cattle, held rifles against intruders. Daughters, let alone 3 at once, meant mouths to feed and no one to bear his legacy. The walls of the house seemed to shrink with his rage until, with one motion, he threw open the door. Cold night air swept across Clara May's bed, making the babies whimper. "You've shamed me," Thomas hissed. "Shamed this ranch. You and those girls. Get out." Her body was still trembling from labor, her limbs too weak to fight. Yet she gathered the 3 tiny bundles against her chest, tears streaming as the midwife turned her face away. The door slammed shut, and the thundering silence of rejection swallowed her whole. The plains stretched endless before her, moonlight silvering the tall grass. Clara May staggered barefoot, the hem of her dress soaked with blood and earth. Each cry from her daughters was a dagger, yet also a spark that kept her moving. Her heart beat with one fierce vow: she would not let the world break them. If she had to drag her body across the mountains, she would. Days blurred together. She found shelter beneath a broken windmill, fed the babies drops of water from a leather flask abandoned in the dirt. Hunger gnawed her bones, thirst cracked her lips, yet she sang to them in whispers, promising morning would come. The prairie showed no mercy. Coyotes howled in the dark, and the wind carried dust so thick it stung her eyes. Clara May wrapped her girls close, shielding them with the thin shield of her body. It was on the 5th dawn, when the sky was bruised with purple light, that she collapsed beside an old oak at the edge of a cattle trail. The babies whimpered weakly. Clara May pressed her lips to their foreheads, praying someone, anyone, would find them before the earth claimed them. A shadow fell across her. Bootsteps approached, heavy but unhurried. Clara May tried to lift her head, blinking against the sun. A man stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low. His coat was worn, his boots covered in dust. His silence pressed down heavier than words. She gasped, clutching her daughters tighter. "Please," her voice broke. "Don't take them from me. They're all I've got." The man did not answer. His eyes, deep-set and weathered like stone carved by rivers, met hers. He crouched, steady hands resting on his knees, studying the shivering mother and her 3 daughters. Clara May saw no pity in his face, only something stronger, something solid, like the ground beneath her feet. With slow certainty, he extended a hand. Clara May hesitated, fear battling hope in her chest. Men had broken her before, left her to bleed on the dust. But this man's silence held no judgment, no anger. It was a silence born of storm's weather, a silence that listened deeper than any words. Her fingers, trembling, reached out. When his hand closed around hers, calloused and worn, she felt the strength of 1,000 unspoken promises. He lifted her gently, supporting her as though she weighed nothing. With his other arm, he cradled the 3 infants against his chest, his rough palms astonishingly tender. Without a word, he led her along the trail, his stride steady, unshaken by her weakness. They reached a cabin nestled between pines and the rolling hills. Smoke curled from its chimney, and the scent of bread lingered faintly in the air. He opened the door, guided her inside, and laid the babies in a wooden cradle he had once carved, its edges smoothed by time. Clara May sank onto the bed, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion, but her eyes never left him. He moved about the room with quiet purpose, kindling the fire, pouring water, placing bread in her hands. Still he said nothing, yet his silence filled the cabin with a strange peace, as though words would only cheapen the vow he had already made. When night fell and the babies stirred, he was there beside her, steady hands helping her feed them, rocking them back to sleep. In the flickering glow of the hearth, Clara May studied the man who had lifted her from death's door. His face bore scars of old battles, his eyes shadows of grief untold. But where others had turned away, he had reached for her. "Who are you?" she whispered finally, her voice trembling with gratitude and fear alike. The man met her gaze. His lips parted slightly, then closed again, as though the words were locked too deep inside. At last, he spoke only his name, his voice low, rough like gravel carried by the wind. Elias Boone. The sound of it lingered in the small cabin, a name that felt like the earth itself, solid, unyielding, eternal. Clara May's heart ached, but not from fear. For the first time since the night she had been cast out, she allowed herself to believe there might be a tomorrow worth holding on to. The girls slept peacefully, their breaths soft and even. Elias sat in the chair by the fire, his silhouette strong against the glow, as if he had taken it upon himself to guard them through the night. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, carrying with it the distant echo of Thomas Granger's rejection. But Clara May no longer trembled. The door had closed on that chapter, and a new one had opened in silence, in the rough, steady hand of Elias Boone. The winter winds carved sharp edges across the Wyoming plains, yet inside Elias Boone's cabin, a fragile warmth was taking root. Clara May rose each morning to the cry of her daughters, their voices small but insistent, pulling her from restless dreams. The cabin smelled of smoke and pine sap, the fire Elias always stoked before dawn to keep the frost from reaching the cradle. At first, Clara May moved like a shadow in that place, cautious and unsure, her body still carrying the memory of rejection. She watched Elias closely, half expecting him to grow weary of the burden she brought. But he remained steady, rising with the sun, feeding the chickens behind the cabin, mending fences out in the pasture. When he returned, his boots caked in dust, he would always glance first at the cradle where Lydia, Rose, and June slept, as if to count the breaths of the little souls he had chosen to protect. He spoke little. Days would pass with no more than a handful of words from him, yet the silence never felt empty. Clara May began to understand that Elias's quiet was not absence. It was a shield, a space where no cruelty could creep in. His hands spoke in place of his tongue, hands that built, repaired, carried, and offered. When the babies cried through the night, Elias was there, rocking them in the cradle he had made years before, his scarred fingers strangely gentle as they brushed away tears. Clara May found herself studying him in the firelight. His face was cut by years of hard labor and loneliness, a map of unspoken trials. A deep scar traced from his temple to his jaw, never explained, though once she caught him staring at it in the mirror, his eyes hollow with a memory he would not share. She wanted to ask, but the words always dissolved on her tongue. In truth, she feared that opening his wounds would only deepen her own. Instead, she poured her strength into her daughters. Lydia was the first to open her eyes wide to the world, dark and searching. Rose carried a softer spirit, often soothed by the sound of Clara May's voice. And June, the smallest, fought hardest to hold on, her tiny fists clenching with surprising strength whenever Clara May feared she was too weak. Together they anchored her, each breath a reminder that she could not let despair swallow her. The cabin slowly became home. Clara May mended curtains from old cloth, filled jars with dried beans, and hummed lullabies as she scrubbed the wooden floor. It was far from the ranch house Thomas had cast her out of. There were no polished lamps, no servants moving quietly in the halls. But here there was no venom, no weight of judgment pressing against her chest. Still, the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. Once a week, Elias hitched the mule to his wagon and drove into town for supplies. Clara May had not yet dared to go with him, fearing the eyes of those who would whisper her shame. But one evening, after he returned, she noticed the faintest shift in his silence. He set down the sacks of flour and beans, his movements slower than usual, and though his mouth said nothing, his eyes met hers with something that unsettled her. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice low. Elias pulled off his hat, brushed the dust from it, and set it on the table. He did not answer. That silence told her more than words ever could. She turned away, swallowing the ache rising in her chest. She knew what the townsfolk must have whispered, that Clara May Granger had been cast out for failing to give her husband a son, that she wandered with 3 girls and no place to call her own. Shame in a western town spread faster than wildfire, and mercy was rarely offered to women. That night, after the babies had fallen asleep, Clara May sat by the fire, staring at the flames. "They'll never let me forget it," she murmured. "Not them, not him. I'll always be the woman who wasn't enough." Elias sat across from her, sharpening a blade against a whetstone. The rasp of steel on stone filled the silence. At last he stopped, set the knife down, and looked at her. His voice, rough but steady, broke the quiet. "You're more than enough." The words were few, but they struck deep. Clara May felt her throat tighten. Elias Boone was not a man who wasted speech. For him to choose those words, 3 simple words, was more than any long sermon could have given her. She nodded once, unable to reply, but her heart carried the weight of his truth. As spring came, the land softened. Snow melted into streams that threaded through the hills, and the fields turned green. Clara May carried her daughters outside, laying them on blankets beneath the wide sky. They reached for the sunlight, tiny fingers grasping at air, while Elias worked in the distance, his figure tall against the horizon. She often caught herself watching him, wondering what force of mercy had placed him on that trail the morning she had nearly given up. But even as new life grew around them, shadows lingered. One afternoon, as Elias returned from town, Clara May noticed a tightness in his jaw. He unloaded the wagon in silence, but she saw the letter tucked in his coat pocket. Later, while he chopped wood, she found it on the table. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Thomas Granger's name was written at the bottom. The words were cruel, but laced with a desperate pride. He demanded the return of what was his, Clara May, and the daughters he had rejected. He claimed he had acted in anger, but that the Granger name must be preserved, even by daughters if sons were denied him. He threatened shame upon Elias if he did not release her back. Clara May's stomach churned. She knew Thomas. His threats were not idle. A man like him could twist the town against Elias, could drag her daughters into a life where their worth would forever be weighed against the absence of a brother. When Elias returned inside, she held the letter in shaking hands. "You knew," she whispered. He met her eyes, his silence heavy as stone. Then he took the letter, tossed it into the fire, and watched it burn. The flames consumed Thomas Granger's words, curling them into ash. Elias's voice, when it came, was low and certain. "He cast you out. He doesn't get to take you back." Clara May's breath caught. The firelight reflected in his eyes, steady and unflinching. For a moment she wanted to believe the world could truly be that simple, that a man's cruelty could be turned to dust with nothing more than flame and silence. But fear whispered otherwise. In the weeks that followed, she felt the weight of Thomas's shadow pressing closer. At night she dreamed of his voice, harsh and bitter, and woke to find Elias sitting by the window, rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He said nothing of the danger, but his watchfulness told her enough. The triplets grew, their laughter filling the cabin with light. Lydia learned to sit up first, rose to crawl, and June, stubborn as the dawn, pulled herself to her feet before her sisters. Clara May clapped and cried, her heart swelling with pride. Yet beneath the joy, a quiet dread grew. What if Thomas came to claim them, tearing apart the fragile peace they had built? One evening, as the sun bled across the plains, Clara May stepped outside to where Elias was repairing the fence. She watched him drive the posts into the earth, each strike of his hammer echoing strength. She swallowed hard. "If he comes," she whispered, "what will you do?" Elias paused, the hammer resting in his hand. He turned, sweat glistening on his brow, and met her eyes. His silence stretched, as if he weighed every answer. Finally, he spoke, "Whatever it takes." The simplicity of his vow sank into her bones. Clara May realized then that she was no longer the woman who had staggered barefoot across the plains, broken and cast aside. She was stronger now, not only because of her daughters, but because of the man who had chosen to stand beside her, even when silence was all he had to give. The western sky stretched endless above them, painted in gold and fire. Clara May lifted June into her arms, her other daughters laughing in the grass. Elias set the hammer down and came to stand beside her, his presence steady as the earth. Together they faced the horizon, knowing the storm of the past had not finished with them. But for the first time, Clara May did not tremble. She was ready. The summer sun hung heavy over the plains, turning the grasses gold and the sky a relentless blue. Clara May carried a pail of water from the well, her daughters tumbling through the yard on unsteady feet. Lydia chased butterflies, Rose trailed after her with arms outstretched, and June clung stubbornly to the fence rail, determined to climb higher than her sisters. Their laughter rippled across the land like a hymn, a sound that once Clara May feared she might never hear. Elias Boone watched from the porch, hat tipped low, pipe unlit between his teeth. His silence remained his truest companion, yet Clara May had learned to read him better than words. The faint curve at the corner of his mouth, the ease in his shoulders, these were his smiles, quiet but sure. Still, shadows lingered. Word drifted through the townsfolk like smoke. Thomas Granger had not forgotten. He was rallying support, stirring whispers that Clara May belonged with him, that the triplets bore his name, and that Elias Boone had no right to keep what was his. Clara May heard the talk whenever she ventured to town. Women who once greeted her now turned their faces. Men muttered as she passed, their eyes sharp with judgment. She carried her head high, though each word pressed like a stone upon her chest. Only when she returned to the cabin, where Elias's silence steadied her, did she allow herself to tremble. One evening, as the cicadas sang in the grass, a rider appeared on the ridge. Clara May stiffened at the sight of him. Tall in the saddle, shoulders squared, arrogance in every line of his posture. Thomas Granger. The daughters clung to her skirts as the horse descended the slope. Elias stepped from the porch, rifle in hand but lowered, his presence like a wall between Clara May and the past. Thomas reined in before the gate, dust swirling around him. His eyes, cold and hard, swept over Clara May before settling on the children. "So it's true," he drawled. "You're hiding here, wasting away in this shack with Boone, while my daughters grow up without their rightful name." "They're not yours," Clara May said, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "You gave them up the night you cast us out." His jaw tightened. "They carry my blood. That's enough. You'll come back with me, Clara. All of you. The Granger name will not die with me." Elias shifted his stance, the rifle glinting in the sunset. He said nothing, but his silence roared louder than Thomas's words. Clara May felt it, the unspoken promise in his stillness, "Not while I draw breath." Thomas sneered. "You think this mute cowhand can protect you? He can't even speak for himself. You belong with me, Clara. These girls deserve a father, not a broken man." The insult cut deep, but Elias did not flinch. His eyes, steady as stone, held Thomas's gaze. Clara May stepped forward then, her daughters clutching at her skirts, and lifted her chin. "They have a father," she said. "A man who holds them when they cry, who works his hands raw to feed them, who never once turned his back on us. He doesn't need to shout it, Thomas. He proves it every day." The air crackled with tension. Thomas's hand twitched near his holster. Elias's rifle rose, slow and deliberate, barrel gleaming in the dusk. For a heartbeat the world held still. The cry of a hawk overhead, the rustle of wind through the grass, the quickened breaths of 3 little girls. Then Thomas spat in the dust, yanked his reins, and turned his horse. "This isn't over," he growled, riding hard toward the horizon. When he was gone, Clara May sagged with relief. Elias lowered his rifle, his face unreadable. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how his silence had spoken louder than thunder, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she reached for his hand. He gave it, rough and warm, steady as always. Days turned to weeks. Thomas did not return, though rumors stirred of lawyers and papers, of a fight he would take to the courts if not to the gun. Clara May's fear rose with each whisper. Could he take her daughters with the stroke of a pen, after all the nights she had bled and wept for them? One night, unable to sleep, she found Elias sitting by the fire, whittling wood into the shape of a horse. His eyes lifted to hers, questioning without a sound. "What if he wins?" she whispered. "What if they take the girls away?" Elias set down the carving, his silence stretching long. Then he reached across the table, took her hand in his, and pressed it to his chest. His heartbeat thudded steady beneath her palm. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm. "No man takes what I've sworn to protect." Tears stung her eyes. In his silence, in his rare words, Clara May found the strength she had thought forever lost. The trial never came. Weeks later, word arrived that Thomas Granger had fallen from his horse during a storm, pride and fury shattered in an instant. Some called it tragedy, others justice. Clara May only felt the weight lift from her shoulders, as if the chains of his voice had finally broken. Life settled into rhythm. The triplets grew, their laughter chasing away the ghosts of the past. Clara May planted a garden beside the cabin, herbs and flowers springing up where once there had been only dust. Elias built them a larger home with his own hands, each beam and board a testament to quiet devotion. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke, Clara May watched Elias lift Lydia onto his shoulders while Rose and June clung to his legs, squealing with joy. The sight filled her chest with a warmth so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She stepped onto the porch, heart trembling, and spoke the truth she had carried too long. "You saved us, Elias Boone. You saved me." He turned, the fading sunlight carving shadows across his scarred face. For once, his silence broke without hesitation. "You saved me, too." Clara May crossed the yard, her daughter's laughter ringing around them, and took his hand. In that moment, beneath the endless western sky, she knew the truth. She had been cast out to find the only place she truly belonged. And in the silence of a man who spoke with deeds instead of words, Clara May found not just refuge, but a love deeper than the mountains, stronger than the plains, and eternal as the stars. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now. Watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in the way you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.